My name is Caitlin Richard. I am a Senior Project Manager for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans District, and I will be presenting on the tentatively selected plan for the Amite River and Tributaries Louisiana Feasibility Study as described in the Supplemental Second Draft Integrated Feasibility Report with Environmental Assessment. This document was released for public review on December 15th. The report is available at the link here on this slide, and you can also scan the barcode at the bottom right to pull up the link on your smartphone. Additionally, we will be hosting virtual public meetings on January 18th, the first of which will occur at 10 a.m. and the second of which will occur at 6 p.m. We will be utilizing the WebEx platform. So over the next few slides, I'll be covering several items, including the meeting purpose, or the presentation purpose rather, as well as the background of the feasibility study, which will lead us to the tentatively selected plan. So what is the purpose of this presentation? So I am informing you about the Amite River and Tributaries Feasibility Study. The draft report is available for public review now until January 29th, and it provides information on how the tentatively selected plan was selected, as well as provides details of that plan and in how the study is complying with the National Environmental Policy Act. And so our main goal here during the review period and during our scheduled virtual meetings is to hear from the public. And we would like to hear your thoughts on the tentatively selected plan. And so this serves as an opportunity for the public as well as other government agencies and partners to have their voices heard. And so what is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA? NEPA was signed into law by President Nixon on January 1st, 1970, and it is the underlying environmental law requiring all federal agencies to notify the public of proposed actions, solicit their input, develop and evaluate a range of alternatives, and explain how decisions were reached. And we're at that stage in the NEPA process where we've identified our purpose and need and considered a range of alternatives and their impacts. Currently, the Corps of Engineers has identified a tentatively selected plan for this study and is notifying the public through our report and through the virtual meetings of the proposed action, and we are requesting your input. Further, NEPA is thought of as the umbrella integrating all other environmental compliance acts, laws, and regulations. Compliance with these individual acts is required to comply with NEPA, and in this capacity, NEPA functions as an umbrella statute. It provides the framework to coordinate and demonstrate compliance with these other laws. Environmental laws such as the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act, among many others, are working in tandem with NEPA to ensure that the Army Corps of Engineers considers impacts in not only the human and natural resources, and identify how to first avoid and then mitigate for adverse impacts. And so we've documented our compliance status with all relevant compliance acts, laws, and regulations, which includes and is not limited to the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act, to name a few for this project. And so how we documented our NEPA compliance is through an environmental assessment, or an EA. And the purpose and need of an EA describes and answers the following questions. What's the purpose of the project? What is the goal trying to be achieved? Why is the project needed? Is there a reasonable, foreseeable need for the proposed project? EAs include alternatives that could be used to reach the goal of the project, such as the no action alternative, the proposed action or the tentatively selected plan, and a reasonable range of alternatives. The affected environment is assessed through the baseline conditions of the human environment that could potentially be affected. And environmental consequences are also assessed and could include positive benefits to the environment. And so we ask ourselves the question, how will building, operating, and maintaining this project affect those baseline conditions of the human environment? As was previously mentioned, the Supplemental Second Draft EA was released on December 15th. The public review and comment period is open for 45 days and will be ending on January 29th. The public has the opportunity to provide comments in a variety of ways and is encouraged to do so, the best of which would be in writing through traditional mail at the mailing address identified on the screen, as well as through email at the amitefs@usace.army.mil email address, and that is AMITEFS@usace.army.mil. And so before going into the rest of the study background, it's important to start off with the study objectives, because the objectives help frame the scope for your feasibility study. And there are 4 objectives for this particular study, the first 2 being the main priorities. So firstly, we aim to reduce the risk to human life from flooding. And this area has seen many flooding events. The March and August 2016 floods are some of the more recent floods in memory. The second objective is to reduce the flood damages to residential and non-residential structures, as well as businesses, industrial, commercial, and agricultural facilities. And then the third and fourth objectives aim to reduce interruption to critical infrastructure, which includes evacuation routes. And it is important to note the coordination in our feasibility study because it is through early and continued coordination with the public, stakeholders, and other agencies that we develop alternatives and conduct that planning process. And so it is an essential key part of the feasibility phase. And so this coordination helps in determining the appropriate level of documentation and analysis needed in developing and refining the study purpose, goals, objectives, constraints, and the range of alternatives to consider. And agency coordination helps us determine the impacts to the resources, possible mitigation measures, opportunities for environmental enhancement, as well as in identifying the NEPA and permit requirements of other agencies. And so since the start of this study, we have been engaged with our non-federal sponsor, the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. And then during the early phases of planning, we held several public information meetings as well as government stakeholder meetings with federally recognized tribes. Subsequently, 2 in-person public NEPA scoping meetings were conducted by the New Orleans District in December of 2019. And the purpose of these meetings was to present the stakeholders and the public with alternative plans that had been developed under the study, and then obtain feedback to ensure that the study area's problems were being addressed by the alternatives being considered. And then lastly, after additional resources were allocated in 2022, and I'll touch on that on a later slide, the Corps of Engineers held 2 environmental justice outreach meetings to communicate the study objective and the path forward, which included investigation of a non-structural alternative or plan in the study area. And then to define environmental justice here, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, regarding the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations, without any particular group experiencing disproportionate burdens of environmental harms or risks. And so those meetings, those outreach meetings, serve to inform those communities, and they are considered to be significant stakeholders when it comes to coordinating during the feasibility process. Moving on to flooding sources, the documented sources of flooding and flood damages in the study area are from multiple sources, including riverine from rainfall and residual flood damages associated with hurricanes and storm surge flood events. And the upper portion of the study area, upper portion of the Amite River Basin, experiences flooding predominantly due to rainfall and riverine flooding. And then the lower half of that basin includes flooding from not only rainfall, but from backwater flooding and storm surge. These flood events have increased the risk to life and safety. They've increased risk of flood damages to property and critical infrastructure, including the evacuation routes such as I-10 and I-12. And there have been economic losses from these different flooding events. Sea level rise and subsidence are expected to continue, so that will increase flood risk for the lower portion of the basin into the future. Just to give a general overview of our study here, the study authority is from 1967, and it has been used several times to study flood risk management measures in the area. And there are two currently authorized Bipartisan Budget Act 2018 construction projects, the Amite River Diversion and the East Baton Rouge Flood Risk Reduction projects, that have resulted from this study authority. And you can see those projects in purple and green on the map to the right. The non-federal sponsor for this study is the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and we have partnered with them throughout this process and will continue to do so. And so the Corps of Engineers refers to studies as being 3x3x3 compliant. And what that means is that studies are to be completed in 3 years, $3 million, and with 3 levels of vertical team engagement and review from district, division, and headquarters. And so this is required by law in the Water Resources Reform Development Act of 2014. And this process is centered around decision-focused planning rather than, say, task-oriented planning. And so you're reorienting the planning process away from simply collecting data or completing specific tasks, and then you're focusing it on doing the work required to reduce uncertainty to the point where the team can make an iterative sequence of planning decisions required to complete a study in full compliance with environmental laws and statutes. And so this particular study was initiated in October of 2018, and therefore the study's initial timeline ended in October of 2021. Some cases, there are study efforts that do not fit the mold of 3 million in 3 years, and they may require a larger expanded effort and analysis. And so certainly with a study area as massive as this one, with the complex flooding issues that stem from rainfall and backwater flooding and surge, additional analysis is required to recommend a comprehensive and effective flood risk management plan for the residents in the study area. And this study is definitely one of those cases, and a request for additional time and funding was necessary to proceed. Essentially, that process for requesting additional time and funding starts with developing a path forward with scope, schedule, and budget, and then obtaining alignment through intensive reviews at every level of the Corps of Engineers. And in this presentation, you'll often hear me refer to the request for additional time and funding as a request for additional resources, or in some cases, a request for an exemption. But ultimately, an approval for the additional resources is granted by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. And before I move on here, it is important to note that the study was 100% federally funded through the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. And this does apply to the additional funding that was requested on top of the original $3 million. And so the decision to approve the request for additional time and funding was approved by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works in November of 2022. And the team conducted extensive hydrologic modeling and a non-structural evaluation, which led us to a tentatively selected plan. And so that request for additional time and funding included an effort in the amount of $1.91 million and another 20 months of non-structural evaluation. And so on December 15th, that draft report was released, and we are currently in reviews as indicated in yellow on the slide. Additionally, the team is conducting what we call feasibility level design, and that includes refinements to the hydrologic modeling as well as the costs and the benefits, which I'll cover on a later slide, as well as refinements to the non-structural implementation plan. And so since the beginning of this feasibility study, it was identified within this large study area that the topography played a key role in how we address the flood risk management. And so in the upper half of that basin, water flows to the south. But once you reach that middle terrace area, the topography is very flat, and that can limit the planning process. And this very flat area in the lower half of this basin includes areas where influences of river stages are impacted by backwater flooding and surge. And so since the study authority limited the formulation of alternatives to flood risk management or rainfall and riverine flooding, the team focused very heavily on large-scale solutions. And once those were identified, the alternatives were then focused on identifying structural solutions based on economic damages. Non-structural alternatives were also developed concurrently with a focus on socially vulnerable communities. And then before I move on here, both rainfall and storm surge were modeled in our evaluation. While it was limited to flood risk management, which is specific to impacts due to flooding from rainfall and riverine flooding, storm surge was considered as a residual risk for these structures. Going back to 2019 again here, a draft report was released which identified a tentatively selected plan that included a large-scale dry dam, otherwise referred to as the Darlington Dam, as well as a non-structural component for residual risk. And essentially there'd be structures that would still see flood risk with the dam in place, and that would involve elevating those homes and flood-proofing those businesses. And that would have been an earthen dam, approximately 80 feet high, located between East Feliciana and St. Helena parishes. And this plan had a total cost of $2.3 billion and a benefit cost ratio of 1.2. These are numbers from 2019. And while this plan was preliminarily determined to be feasible, there were concerns raised during reviews as well as during evaluation, and we did regroup with our non-federal sponsor, and specifically the state of Louisiana, and revised our path forward to include further evaluation of a non-structural plan. The previously recommended plan has since been screened out due to several concerns, one of which has to do with implementability. There is a lack of soil data in the area of the dam, and that is required to inform the design. We would need that data in order to provide a sufficient design to ensure constructability. Additionally, due to the unknowns inclusive of the soils and the area, cost contingencies for that plan are certainly higher than they were in 2019. The other concern is focused on social impacts and acceptability. The construction of this dam would potentially impact socially vulnerable areas, and so therefore there's a potential for high adverse, disproportionate, and direct impacts to historically disadvantaged communities, and these communities would not see a benefit to the flood risk management project. The benefit of this project would be seen downstream of the dam. Furthermore, there was significant public dispute regarding the plan, and again, the plan was screened due to concerns and risks regarding implementability and social impacts and acceptability. There were several other plans considered in that final array of alternatives, including the Darlington Dam, and after that final array was re-evaluated and based on the concerns and available information on the Darlington Dam, that alternative was deemed to not meet risk guidelines due to economic risk and cost effectiveness, as well as potential societal life risk and environmental acceptability. And so again, for those reasons, the Darlington Dam alternative, as well as the dry dams along tributaries that we looked at, were removed from further consideration, consistent with policy of acceptability and implementability. And so once we screened those dams, the evaluation of those non-structural plans, or of a non-structural only plan rather, was moved forward. And what do we mean when we say non-structural only plan? Under a non-structural only plan, you would be talking about measures for potentially eligible structures that would see elevating residential structures up to the 100-year level of protection, and that would be no greater than 13 feet above the ground. You could see dry flood proofing of structures to ensure that the floodwaters can't get inside, making the walls, doors, windows, other openings impermeable to water, and that would be done up to 3 feet above grade. Wet flood proofing is also a non-structural measure, and that would include structures up to 12 feet, wet flood proofing up to 12 feet to prevent damages. And then you can also see other risk mitigation measures under a non-structural plan, which would be typically conducted by local entities such as the state, and those can include floodplain management plans, building codes, zoning regulations, and flood warning systems. And so there are many benefits to a non-structural alternative, and that includes minimal to no operations and maintenance, minimal to no environmental impacts, and long-term risk reduction by reducing and reoccurring flood damages. And another aspect of non-structural plans could usually include acquisition or buyouts and relocating those structures. For this specific study, that measure was not cost effective, and it did not move forward. And so thinking back to 2019 again, we looked at a non-structural only plan in our final array of alternatives. And that plan included eligibility for structures located within the 25-year floodplain throughout the entire study area. And continuing our non-structural evaluation, we optimized that plan by grouping structures together that shared similar flood characteristics, such as a shared flood source. And so there are 106 economic reaches in the study area, and there were 57 groupings or aggregates of structures identified according to shared flood characteristics. And so aside from the number of structures identified within the 25-year floodplain, structures were identified as being located in the 10 and 50-year floodplain, and those were considered in the economic evaluation as well. And the first developed non-structural alternative was the National Economic Development Plan, and that is the plan that maximizes your net benefits or reduces the most damages from flooding. And so an assessment of all structures located in the 10, 25, and 50-year floodplain was performed, and the net benefits of each separate grouping or aggregate of structures was analyzed based on the damages they would incur. And so when maximizing these benefits on the individual aggregate or grouping level, the National Economic Development Plan included 46 aggregates or groupings within the 10-year floodplain, 5 within the 25-year floodplain, and 6 within the 50-year floodplain. And so in total, over 3,100 structures would potentially be eligible to participate in the National Economic Development Non-Structural Plan. And so after we developed the National Economic Development Plan, the team conducted a total benefits analysis. And 2 alternatives were developed to increase comprehensive benefits, and more specifically, flood risk management benefits to socially vulnerable communities. And the primary database that was used to represent social vulnerability data was the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And this database was utilized over other tools because the 4 themes that make up that index are designed to represent how well a community responds and recovers from a natural disaster like a major flooding event. And this database specifically, making this database specifically applicable to a flood risk management study. And so social vulnerability data included representation for socioeconomic status, age, disabilities, language, minority status, housing, and transportation. And areas that were in the 90th percentile or higher were flagged as having high social vulnerability. And embedded in that overall social vulnerability score is the 2 metrics necessary for environmental justice documentation under Executive Order 12898. And because of this reason, the team felt that this was an appropriate tool to address environmental justice and social vulnerability in a flood risk management setting. And so the team used this index, they used this data to further subdivide those aggregates I just mentioned, used in the National Economic Development Plan, into 19 socially vulnerable sub-aggregates, which allowed for evaluation of impacts and formulation of alternatives specific to areas experiencing social vulnerability. And so these two additional alternatives are shown here on the screen in addition to the National Economic Development Plan shown as Plan 2. And so the alternatives not only incorporate that National Economic Development Plan, but they include considerations and benefits for other social effects, such as benefits to socially vulnerable communities. And so in Plan 3, you have an expanded eligibility that includes all structures within the socially vulnerable subaggregates that had positive net benefits when compared to the construction of the larger aggregate or grouping of structures that was used. Going further into Plan 4, that expanded eligibility to include all structures within socially vulnerable subaggregates at the next highest floodplain, whether or not they produce positive or negative net benefits. And so in comparison, there were 3,298 structures potentially eligible under Plan 4 versus the 3,117 structures potentially eligible under Plan 2. And so what portion of the structures eligible to participate in the plan are located in environmental justice communities? And environmental justice, as it relates to the Justice 40 initiative, according to Presidential Executive Order 14008, was evaluated by determining how many structures are included in the plans within areas of concern according to the Council on Environmental Quality's Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And so Plan 2 included 1,262 structures, or 40% of total structures in areas of environmental justice concern. Plan 3 included an additional 22 structures in areas of environmental justice concern for a total of 1,284 structures, or 40% of the total eligible structures in the plan. And then lastly, Plan 4 included an additional 172 structures in areas of environmental justice concern for a total of 1,324 structures, or 40% of the total eligible structures in the plan. The tentatively selected plan presently is Plan 4, the non-structural plan with the additive for other social effects for positive and negative benefits, because it provides flood risk reduction in terms of national economic development, along with the added benefit of flood risk management to vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, maximizing the benefits to those socially vulnerable areas. And so while this plan is not the NED plan, it provides the best level of comprehensive flood risk reduction to the study area and is the total benefits plan for this study. And so this plan has a preliminary cost range between $1.5 billion to $1.6 billion with a benefit to cost ratio within a range of 1.06 to 0.997. These costs and benefits will continue to be refined in the feasibility process. A policy exception must also be granted to recommend the total benefits plan, and if that exception is not granted, that plan, our tentatively selected plan, will resort back to Plan 2, our non-structural national economic development plan. And so in summary, the net benefits of each aggregate or grouping of structures which employed the aggregation method as described previously were analyzed based on the damages that would incur. And so using this method, 57 floodplain aggregates, again, or groupings of structures, were identified. And the net benefits of each aggregate were analyzed based on the damages they would incur at the 10, 25, and 50-year events. The event that had the highest return of net benefits per aggregation was chosen. And next, the aggregates used to identify that National Economic Development Plan were further subdivided into 19 socially vulnerable sub-aggregates. The primary database used to represent social vulnerability data was the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, and the next highest aggregation for each of the socially vulnerable subaggregates, regardless of economic justification, was included to identify the total benefits plan. This plan would be cost shared with our non-federal sponsor at 35% federal costs and 65% federal costs and 35% non-federal costs. The total structures in this total benefits plan include 3,298 structures, of which 2,918 would be elevated and 318 would be flood-proofed. And so what's next? We will continue to receive public comment as well as comments from our technical experts across the Corps of Engineers and policy and legal compliance comments from our division and our headquarters. And the team will address these comments as necessary, and we would be headed towards an agency decision milestone at the end of February. This milestone, if successful, would mark the agency's endorsement of the plan and the approval to move forward with finalizing the report. Again, if successful at that milestone, the team would be finalizing the report and going through more agency technical reviews, another round of legal reviews prior to submitting the report to our division in April for final policy and legal compliance reviews, as well as state and agency reviews and a final public review. And so there are several rounds of review remaining. A chief's report would then mark the completion of the study in July. And so in July, that chief's report would be signed by the Chief of Engineers for the Corps of Engineers. And it is important to note that that is not the last stop before construction. This plan would require at least 2 congressional actions to move forward to that phase. Authorization for construction would be required, as well as appropriations. And so we would need funding to proceed with pre-construction engineering and design and the construction phase itself. At the very earliest, 2026 would be when construction could start, assuming that authorization and appropriations are in place at that point. And so finally, as a reminder, we've come to you to ask for your input. How do you view the tentatively selected plan? Do you have any modifications or concerns regarding that plan? We want to hear your comments, whether they be positive or negative, and the best way to do that would be in writing via email or mail. So please consider several of these questions that you see on the screen when submitting your comments. And so we are accepting comments through January 29th, 2024. And again, you can access that draft document at the link shown on the screen. And you can also scan the barcode on the lower right corner of the screen as well to access it through your smartphone. Written comment is the best way to submit your comments, and you can do that through email or through traditional mail, sending it to the mailing address as identified on the screen. And so with that, that does conclude the presentation regarding the Amite River and Tributaries Feasibility Study Tentatively Selected Plan.